is Thursday morning, February 25th. Have something cool this morning. I have my Shalom, y'all, coffee cup this morning. It's part Jewish, part Texan. Well, it's interesting because today's test, we are in the middle of Lent, 40 days of testing, and today is day number 8. And today's test is in the book of Judges, chapter 2. So let's turn to Judges, chapter 2, and we're going to find out why it's interesting that Pastor Big Al has his Shalom, y'all, coffee cup. So in Judges, chapter 2, starting with verse 20, says, "So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua." Chapter 3. "Now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generation of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly. These nations are the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for testing Israel, to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses." So the story is that God has left all these nations around Israel. He has left their enemies in order to test them. He's left them to test them. It would have been amazing for Israel if God would have just completely wiped out all of their enemies and Israel could get into the land of Israel that God has given them, and they could just live happily ever after. But God left the nations. He left their enemies in order to test them. Now, what are they going to be testing about? The first thing was he's going to test them to see if they would obey the commandments. These nations, these enemies that God left, they're going to tempt Israel to follow other gods and to serve other gods. And so that would be a very difficult test for them to see if they would obey the commandments of God or if they would follow after their enemies and worship the gods of their enemies. But the second test was they were to teach them war. Because all of Israel that came into the promised land, they hadn't seen any war. All the warriors, all the fighting men had died in the wilderness. So now we have men that don't know about warfare. And so these nations, these enemies, were left in order to teach Israel about war. I began to think about that. What if Jesus, when he came, he completely did away with Satan, completely wiped Satan off the map, wiped all the demonic forces off the map so that there wouldn't be any tempting, at all. And we know that in the millennial reign, the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, we know that Satan will be bound for 1,000 years in the abyss, and there will be no temptation for 1,000 years. He won't be able to go out and tempt everybody. So wouldn't it have been awesome if God had just removed all the enemies so that we wouldn't have to face any enemies? That we could just live our Christian life in peace, right? But God left the enemies. He left the enemies in order to test us, whether or not we're going to obey the commands of God and to teach us war. to show us what it means to spiritually fight. Because it would be a horrible thing for a generation to raise up that did not know about spiritual warfare. Today is actually a pretty interesting day in the Jewish calendar. Today is the 13th day of the 12th month. And the 13th day of the 12th month is important because that is the very day that Haman, the enemy of the Jews, was going to wipe out and destroy all of the Jews. And we find that in Esther, the book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 12. It says, "Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and the princes of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and they sealed with the king's signet ring." Verse 13 says, "Letters were sent by the couriers to all the king's province to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder." So today is actually the day of Israel's enemies, the day of Haman, the day that all Israel was going to be destroyed. But it's a good thing that there was one among them, a man by the name of Mordecai, who knew what it meant to still fight. And he put himself in sackcloth and ashes, and he began to pray and fast. And Esther would later on also call all around her to fast because this was a spiritual battle that was going on. My prayer is these 40 days of the season of Lent, 40 days of testing, that God would raise up spiritual warriors who are ready, who understand what it means to fight. Thank you, guys. I pray y'all have a blessed and amazing day.